Hello again, everyone. Welcome to our first video lecture on our coverage of Chapter 10. In this chapter, we move beyond some of the basic elements of operant conditioning and into some elements that look a bit more like real life. In particular, focusing on what happens when we have multiple different opportunities available for reinforcement. How do we decide which to go with? Or as the behaviorists like to characterize it, how do we make choices? So our characterization of operant conditioning thus far has been a little bit off base. It's a little bit sterile. It's a little bit out of line with what's happening in real life. Because ultimately, in real life, we frequently aren't faced with a scenario where we only have one single source of reinforcement available. In fact, most of the time, we have many different sources of reinforcement available, and we have to choose between those sources of reinforcement to decide what behavior to perform. You can think about it from the perspective of studying for your classes versus socializing with your peers versus performing some activity, some hobby that you find enjoyable. All three of these things have reinforcement value. And somehow you have to decide which of these reinforcers is the one that we want to go with. We would refer to this as having a series of concurrent schedules of reinforcement available to us. A concurrent schedule of reinforcement is where we have simultaneous schedules of reinforcement available. Each has its own discriminative stimulus, each has its own reinforcement. So this represents what we call a choice. And the focus of this chapter is initially on how do we make these choices. So some examples. Do I go to the gym or do I go out to dinner? Do I eat an apple or do I eat cookies for a late night snack? Do I look at social media while I'm at dinner or do I have a conversation with my date? The list could go on and on. These are all choice situations that we have. And while we like to believe that we govern our own choices, the behaviorists have found that that's not necessarily the case all of the time. In fact, there are many elements that are unconscious, that are related to the environment, that are driving the choices that we make. And we'll discuss some of those ideas in future videos. The behaviorists made some of these discoveries by looking not at humans, but at birds, pigeons in particular. And one of the really fascinating things about birds and about rats and about people is that our decision-making processes are really predictable. In fact, there are some strategies that appear to be inherent to all organisms when it comes to making choice decisions. So here's a really, really basic scenario. We have our pigeon here. He's trained to peck either a red key or a green key to get reinforcement. He's on a concurrent schedule, and the red key is on a VR20, a variable ratio 20 schedule, and the green key is on a VR50, variable ratio 50 schedule. If you were the pigeon, would you select schedule A or would you select schedule B? The obvious correct answer is you would select schedule A, and you would spend all of your time pressing the red key because you're going to get far more reinforcement, a little bit more than double the amount of reinforcement from the red key than you are from the green key. What happens if we switch these to a VI schedule instead. So let's say we did a variable interval schedule of 20 seconds for key A and a variable interval schedule of 50 seconds for key B. Now what is your strategy? This one's a little bit different. Now we would spend most of our time pressing the red key, but it would be worth our while to occasionally switch over to the green key once we figured out the different time intervals. But what happens if we have one of them that's a variable interval schedule and one of them that's a variable ratio schedule? So let's say we keep the green key variable ratio of 50, but we make the red key a variable interval of 20 seconds. Now the effective strategy becomes spend most of your time pushing the green key and occasionally switch over and hit the red key just to check that that variable interval has passed. So now we have scenarios here, some of which it's optimal to just make the same response on the same option all of the time. But other times it's worthwhile to switch between the two. And while this seems like a strange and probably foreign way to look at choice behavior, especially as it relates to humans, do I study for my learning and conditioning class or do I go hang out with my friends? The truth of the matter is, by looking at how animals respond to these things, we actually get a really good sense of how we can predict what humans will do to respond to these things.